When the ambulance doors swung open in front of the hospital, Andrew stood frozen under the gently falling snow. His face, weathered with age and worry, was a mixture of panic and fragile hope. He had rushed there, leaving everything behind, desperate to see his greatest treasure. His son, Paul, the paramedics, unloaded the stretcher quickly, and as Andrew caught sight of his son, a knot tightened in his stomach. Paul looked pale, his lips tinged with blue, his breath reduced to a faint, shallow rhythm. As they wheeled him into the emergency room, Paul weakly raised a trembling hand, grasping his father's arm. His eyes, once full of life, now reflected a faint shadow of their former vibrance. Andrew leaned closer, his heart racing with fear. "Take care of him," Paul murmured, his voice a fragile thread. His hand shook as it gripped Andrew's arm. "Promise me, take care of him." "Who are you talking about, son? What do you mean? Do you—" "Paul, hold on, you have to fight, don't leave me." Andrew's voice cracked as tears streamed down his face. He wanted to hold him, to give him strength, but Paul's grip loosened, his head fell gently to the side, and Andrew's worst nightmare became reality. "Paul, no, please don't leave me, son. Please?" He screamed in despair as the doctors pulled him aside and rushed the stretcher through the double doors. The doors closed with a sharp clang, leaving him alone in the cold hallway. The echo of Paul's words ringing in his mind, he collapsed into a nearby chair, covering his face with trembling hands as his body shook with grief. Time became meaningless. The hours stretched on endlessly until a doctor approached with a somber expression. "Mr. Andrew, we did everything we could," the doctor began, but Andrew already knew how the sentence would end. His heart sank as though the air had been ripped from his lungs. Paul, his only son, his very reason for being, was gone that night. Andrew trudged back to his empty home under the relentless snowfall. One question haunted him. Take care of him. Who had Paul meant? His son had never kept secrets from him. Why would his final words be so cryptic? The days that followed blurred into a haze of darkness. Andrew wandered through the empty halls of his massive house, every corner a painful reminder of Paul. His laughter, his boundless energy. Everything was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Andrew's wife had passed away years before, and now without Paul he felt utterly alone. The once vibrant mansion was now nothing more than a mausoleum. 10 years had passed, and though the pain had dulled slightly, Paul's final words still haunted Andrew. Take care of him. He had replayed every moment of his son's life, searching for clues, but he had never found anything that explained those cryptic words. The uncertainty was a weight he carried day and night. His only comfort was Leo, a golden retriever he had adopted shortly after Paul's death. With his warm gaze and unwavering loyalty, Leo had become Andrew's sole companion in his years of solitude. Often, while stroking Leo's soft head, Andrew would whisper Paul's words, as if the dog might somehow offer him the answers he sought. One afternoon, while driving along a snowy back road, Andrew stopped at a modest gas station to refuel. It was a simple place, just a couple of pumps and a small store. Leo stayed in the back seat as Andrew stepped out. A young man approached to assist him, his energetic movements and kind smile lighting up the frosty scene. He couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair and striking blue eyes that seemed to glow with a peculiar warmth. From the moment Andrew saw him, he felt an inexplicable connection, as though something familiar surrounded the young man. "Need help, sir?" the young man asked, his tone polite but casual. Andrew nodded, studying him as he worked. There was something about the way he moved, the sound of his voice. It struck a chord deep within Andrew. Then he saw it, a ring on the young man's hand, its green stone flecked with golden sparks. Andrew froze. That ring. It was unmistakable. He had designed it himself as a special gift for Paul's graduation. It was one of a kind. "Where did you get that ring?" Andrew asked, his voice low but brimming with urgency. The young man glanced at the ring, startled by the question. It was my mom's. She gave it to me before she passed away, said it was special." Andrew felt the ground shift beneath him. The boy's mother had Paul's ring. How could that be? As the young man walked back toward the store, leaving Andrew alone by his car, a truth began to form in Andrew's mind, a truth that could change everything. That night, sitting by the fireplace with Leo at his feet, Andrew couldn't stop thinking about the ring. The image of the young man wearing that impossible object haunted him. He turned a glass of brandy in his hand as memories of Paul flooded back. He remembered the day he gave his son that ring, a symbol of all he wished for him. But now that ring was on a stranger's hand, and Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that a revelation was close. The next morning, driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation, Andrew returned to the gas station. The early morning chill didn't deter him. Leo sat patiently in the back seat, watching intently as Andrew parked. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the small store, his steps firm but tense. The young man was there, stocking shelves behind the counter. When he saw Andrew enter, he greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. Back again. Need something?" Andrew nodded, but instead of answering directly, he pointed at the ring on the young man's hand. "I need to know where that ring came from," the young man frowned. Clearly surprised by the question, he looked down at the ring before replying, "Like I said yesterday, it was my mom's. She gave it to me before she died. She always said it was special, but she didn't tell me much else." "And your mom?" Andrew's voice was steady but weighted with curiosity. "Where did she work? What did she do?" The young man sighed, his expression growing more serious. "She was a waitress at a hotel in the city, worked hard so I could go to school. She always said it wasn't an easy job, but it was worth it to give me a better life." Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the boy's story mirrored Paul's past. He recalled Paul's frequent visits to that hotel, the time he spent there working on projects. Every detail fit, but Andrew needed to be sure. "What's your name?" Andrew finally asked, his eyes locked on the young man's. "James," the young man replied, noticing the shift in Andrew's intensity. "Why do you want to know all this?" Andrew took a moment before answering, his voice soft but laden with emotion. "That ring belonged to my son, Paul. I gave it to him. There's no other like it in the world if your mother had it. It means she and Paul knew each other." James stared at him, his surprise evident. "Paul, he was your son. My mom didn't talk much about my dad, but I think she mentioned that name once. She said he was someone important, someone who couldn't be with us." The boy's words hit Andrew like a tidal wave. The truth was within reach, but it carried an emotional weight that was almost unbearable after years of questioning Paul's final words. Everything seemed to be coming together. "Do you have a photo of your mum?" Andrew asked calmly, trying to keep his emotions in check. James nodded slowly and pulled a worn wallet from his pocket. From it, he retrieved a small, slightly creased photo and handed it to Andrew. "This is her. It's from a few years ago, before she got sick." Andrew took the photo with trembling hands. As his eyes settled on the image, time seemed to stand still. The woman in the photo was beautiful, with a warm smile and lively eyes, and Andrew recognized her immediately. He had seen her before during one of his visits to the hotel years ago. Everything fell into place. "It's her," Andrew whispered, more to himself than to James. "Your mother and my son. They—" James watched him, his expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "What does this mean? Why is the ring so important?" Andrew set the photo on the counter, closing his eyes briefly before answering. "James, I think you're my grandson." The silence that followed was overwhelming. James blinked, struggling to process what he'd just heard. "Your grandson? No, that can't be. My mom never told me anything about this." "Paul didn't know how to tell me," Andrew said, his voice thick with pain. "But I'm certain you're part of my family." James stepped back, his confusion and overwhelm evident. "I need time to think about this," Andrew nodded. "Take all the time you need. But I want you to know something. I'm here. You're not alone." James looked at him for a long moment before nodding and stepping out of the store, leaving Andrew standing there with a heart full of hope and sorrow. Andrew spent the rest of that night sitting by the fireplace, a photograph of James's mother in one hand and a glass of brandy in the other. Leo rested at his feet, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm raging inside his owner. Memories of Paul, the image of the woman in the photo, and James's words all came together like pieces of a puzzle, finally forming a clear picture. It was almost impossible to deny the truth. James was his grandson. But how could he approach him without shattering the fragile connection they had just begun to build? The next day, Andrew decided he couldn't wait any longer. He got in his car and drove to the gas station, determined to speak with James, to offer him answers, and most importantly, a helping hand. When he arrived, he found James inside the small store, stacking shelves. The young man looked up as the door chimed, his expression a mix of surprise and caution. "Mr. Andrew," James said, setting down the items in his hands, "I didn't expect to see you so soon." Andrew offered a calming smile. "I wanted to check on you. After what we talked about yesterday, I figured you might have a lot of questions." James studied him, his blue eyes reflecting a quiet inner turmoil. "I do have questions, but I'm not sure I want the answers." "I understand," Andrew said gently. "It's a lot to take in, but I'm here for whatever you need. I won't push you. I just want to be present." James nodded slowly, as if absorbing the words. After a pause, he gestured toward a small table at the back of the store. "We can talk for a bit. It's quiet around this time." They sat across from each other, and for a moment, silence filled the space. Andrew watched the young man carefully, searching for the right words. He didn't want to make a misstep that could drive him away. "I want to tell you more about Paul," Andrew began, his voice soft but steady. "He wasn't perfect, he made mistakes like we all do, but he had a big heart. He always wanted to do the right thing, even if he didn't always know how." James listened quietly, his hands clasped on the table. "My mom never talked about him much. She used to say there was no point in remembering someone who didn't want to stay." Andrew felt a pang of pain at the words. "I think Paul was scared. Scared of disappointing me. Scared of failing to meet the expectations I had for him. He never should have hidden you, James, but that doesn't mean he didn't love you." James lowered his gaze. His lips pressed together. "It's hard not to feel angry. My whole life I thought I didn't have a father, that I wasn't worth staying for. And now I find out this. It feels like ripping open a wound that had already healed." Andrew reached across the table and placed a hand over James's. "I can't change the past. I can't give you back the years you lost, but I can be here now if you'll let me." James lifted his eyes, a mixture of sadness and hope shimmering in them. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. It's just too much." "I know," Andrew said, his throat tightening, "but I'll wait, James, no matter how long it takes." The young man nodded silently. After a moment, he stood, signaling that the conversation was over for now. Andrew respected his silence and said goodbye with a light squeeze on James's shoulder. As he left, he felt a weight lift from his chest. A seed had been planted. Now, all he could do was wait for it to grow that evening. Back at his sprawling yet lonely mansion, Andrew found himself sorting through Paul's belongings. It had been years since he'd touched those items, fearing the flood of memories they would bring. But now, he needed something. Something tangible to give James, a connection to his father in a drawer. Andrew found a small notebook. Its pages were filled with sketches, thoughts, and fragments of letters Paul had written, but never sent. One letter in particular stopped Andrew in his tracks. It was addressed to James. "My dear son," it began, and Andrew had to pause to steady himself before reading further. The letter was filled with love and regret. Paul admitted his cowardice, confessing that fear had kept him from embracing his responsibilities, but he also expressed hope that one day James would understand that he had always been loved, even if Paul hadn't had the courage to show it. Andrew knew instantly that James needed to have this letter. It was what Paul would have wanted 2 days later. Andrew returned to the gas station, this time with the notebook in hand. James greeted him with less apprehension than before, though the distance between them was still evident. Andrew wasted no time. He placed the notebook on the table in front of James. "This belonged to your father," he said simply. "I think you need to read it." James stared at the notebook as if it were an unfamiliar object, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. He opened to the first page and began to read. As his eyes scanned Paul's words, his expression shifted from confusion to sadness, and finally to a quiet, melancholic calm. "He wrote this for me," James whispered, almost to himself. Andrew nodded. Paul wasn't brave enough to say these things while he was alive, but through those words, he gave you something I never could, a connection to him. James closed the notebook and held it to his chest, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you," he said at last, his voice breaking. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Andrew felt his heart, so often broken, begin to heal. "I'll always be here, James, no matter what." As James looked at him, the barriers between them began to dissolve. They weren't fully there yet, but Andrew could see it, a future where they might truly be a family. For the first time in years, hope felt within reach. Several days passed after Andrew gave James the notebook, though the young man hadn't reached out or made any definitive moves. Andrew sensed that something had shifted. He had seen a flicker of connection in James's eyes, a small opening where there had previously been walls. That spark gave him hope. Meanwhile, Andrew continued with his daily routine, but now there was something more, a faint sense of purpose filling the emptiness that had lingered for years in the evenings. As Leo rested beside him, Andrew would stare into the fire. Thinking of Paul, the mistakes they had both made, and the second chance life had offered him through James, he was determined not to waste it. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the snow-capped hills, the doorbell rang. Andrew rose quickly, his heart racing with anticipation. When he opened the door, there stood James, the notebook in one hand and an uncertain expression on his face. "Can I come in?" James asked, his tone hesitant but steady. "Of course, James, this is your home too," Andrew replied, stepping aside to let him in, recognizing James. Leo bounded over, tail wagging enthusiastically. James crouched to pet him, a shy smile breaking through his otherwise serious demeanor. They moved into the living room, where the fireplace was already crackling. Andrew gestured to an armchair across from him, inviting James to sit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. James stared at the notebook in his hands as though mustering the courage to say what he had come to say. "I've read it all," James began at last, his voice soft but resolute. "Every word. At first I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe I was clinging to something that didn't make sense, but his words, my dad's words, it felt like he was talking directly to me." Andrew nodded slowly, his expression calm but filled with empathy. "Paul didn't always know how to express his feelings, but that notebook is proof of how much he loved you, even if he couldn't be there." James looked up, his eyes shimmering with a mixture of emotions. "It's hard to understand how someone who loved me so much could choose not to be there, but at the same time, I think I can forgive him. Not for his sake, but for mine. That's all Paul ever would have wanted," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "For you to find peace, and if you'll let me, James, I want to be part of your life. I can't replace him, but I can be here for you." James stayed silent for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I don't know how this works. I'm not used to having family, but I think I want to try." Andrew's heart swelled with a joy he hadn't felt in years. He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. "You have no idea what it means to hear that, James." That evening they shared stories. Andrew spoke of Paul, his childhood, his dreams, and the way his laughter could brighten a room. James, in turn, recounted memories of his mother, how hard she worked to provide for him, and how she always put his needs above her own, even if she rarely talked about her sacrifices. The hours slipped by, and for the first time Andrew felt his house, Andrew, once cold and empty, come alive again. In the days that followed, their relationship continued to evolve. James began visiting more frequently, helping with small tasks around the house, and spending time with Leo, who had clearly adopted him. Andrew, for his part, focused on being the support Paul had never been able to be, teaching James about their family history, their roots, and the importance of forging ahead with pride. One afternoon, as they walked through the sprawling garden blanketed in snow, James stopped abruptly and turned to Andrew with a serious expression. "There's something I need to know. Why now? Why, after all these years, did you decide to find me and tell me all this?" Andrew sighed, gazing out at the snowy horizon before answering. "Because I've made many mistakes in my life. I was a father who imposed expectations, who forgot that Paul was a person before he was my son. When I lost him, I realized too late how much I'd failed, and then I heard his final words I didn't understand for years. 'Take care of him,' he said. Those words were for you, even though I didn't know it then. But I know now, and I won't fail again." James studied him, his expression thoughtful before a faint smile broke across his face. "Thank you for telling me. It won't be easy for either of us, but I think I want to try. I want to know more about him, and about you." Andrew felt a surge of pride and relief. He placed a hand on James's shoulder, his gaze warm and tender. "You have no idea how much that means to me." That evening, as they shared a simple meal by the fireplace, James broke the silence with an unexpected thought. "This house, it feels different when I'm here. It doesn't feel empty." Andrew nodded, deeply moved. That's because you bring something I haven't felt in a long time, Hope? They both smiled, and in that moment, the weight of their painful past seemed to ease just a little more. The connection they had found not only honored Paul, but also built something new, something full of promise. Snow fell gently over the mansion's garden, blanketing every corner in a glistening white that shimmered under the twilight sky. Andrew stood at the window of his study, his face lit by the flickering fire in the hearth. Leo sat loyally by his side, as always, but tonight felt different. There was warmth in the house, a sense of life that had been missing for so many years. From the kitchen came the sounds of James. Attempting to cook something simple for dinner, Andrew couldn't help but smile, imagining the young man navigating recipes with a determination that was evident in everything he did. "How's it going in there?" Andrew called out, leaving his spot by the window and heading toward the kitchen. "I think I might need a fire extinguisher," James replied with a nervous laugh, shaking a pan as a small plume of smoke began to rise. "This is way harder than it looks," Andrew let out a hearty laugh, something he hadn't done in years. "Let me help before you burn down the kitchen on your first try." Together, they salvaged the improvised meal. As they worked, their conversation flowed with an ease that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. James shared stories from his childhood, simple yet meaningful moments like afternoons spent helping his mother at the hotel, or the days he dreamed of traveling beyond the small world he knew. Andrew listened intently, treasuring every word. "Your mother was an incredible woman," Andrew said as they set the table. "I can tell by the way you talk about her. I understand why Paul fell in love with someone like her." James nodded, a mixture of pride and melancholy crossing his face. "She always did her best. Even when things were tough, she taught me never to give up, no matter what." That evening, as they sat down to the meal they had saved, the conversation turned deeper. Andrew knew it was time to share something important, something he had been holding on to since meeting James. "I want to talk to you about this house," he began, setting his utensils down. "It's a place that's meant a lot to me, but it's also been a burden for years. These walls reminded me of everything I lost, but now with you here it feels like it could be something else, something new." James looked at him curiously, setting his plate aside. "What do you mean?" "I want this house to be yours," Andrew said, his voice calm though his heart pounded. "Not just a place to live, but a home. I want you to fill it with your dreams and your life. Leo and I will always be here, but I want you to make it your own." James's eyes widened in shock. "I can't accept that. It's too much. This is your home." "No, James," Andrew said firmly, his voice warm yet resolute. "It was my home. Now I want it to be ours, a place where we can build something together, a family." The young man lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by the offer. After a few moments, he looked up, his eyes filled with emotion. "I don't know if I can do that, but I want to try. I want to try for us." Andrew smiled, his heart swelling with joy he hadn't felt in years. That's all I needed to hear. The following days were filled with activity. James began exploring every corner of the mansion, uncovering little details that spoke of Andrew's and Paul's past. In one of those moments, he found a box of old photographs, bringing them to Andrew. The two sat down to look through them, each picture bringing a flood of memories and laughter. "That's Paul on his first day of school," Andrew said, pointing to a photo of a grinning boy with a backpack far too big for his small frame. He was so nervous he almost refused to get out of the car. James smiled, running his fingers over the image. "It's strange, but I feel like I know him, even though I never met him." "That's because so much of him is in you," Andrew replied, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "That warmth, that light, it's part of who you are." Their bond deepened with each passing day, and soon the mansion no longer felt like a place of shadows, but a true home. Leo seemed to feel it too, always following James enthusiastically, as if he knew everything was finally as it should be. On Christmas Eve, Andrew and James sat by the fireplace with Leo resting contentedly between them. The snow fell softly outside, cloaking the world in a quiet peace that seemed made just for them. "Thank you for staying," Andrew said softly, looking at James with eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." James smiled, his expression serene. "Thank you for finding me, I think. We both needed this." Andrew nodded, feeling that for the first time in a long while, everything was as it should be. "Merry Christmas, James." "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," James replied, his voice filled with a warmth that lit up the entire room. ChatGPT. The snow continued to fall gently over the quiet town, blanketing everything in a pristine white glow under the dim light of the street lamps. Inside the mansion, the warmth of the fire mirrored the newfound peace within its walls. James sat by the crackling fireplace, Leo snoozing at his feet, cradling a small box in his hands. Andrew had given it to him earlier that day. "Open it when you're ready," Andrew had said, his tone gentle but deliberate. "It's something I believe belongs to you." Now, with the dancing flames casting soft shadows on the room, James carefully opened the box. Inside was an antique pocket watch, perfectly preserved, along with a note written in Andrew's meticulous handwriting. "This watch belonged to your grandfather, and then to your father. It is a symbol of our family, of the moments we've shared and those yet to come. It's yours now to remind you of where you come from and where you can go." James traced the intricate engravings on the watch, feeling the weight of its history. He imagined his father holding it, checking the time at some pivotal moment in his life. It was a tangible connection to a man he had never known, but now felt closer to than ever before. "What did you find?" Andrew asked, entering the room with 2 steaming cups of tea. He sat across from James, placing the mugs on the table between them. "The watch," James said, holding it up for Andrew to see. "That's beautiful, thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Andrew replied with a warm smile. "It's yours, it always has been. I was just waiting for the right time to give it back." James nodded, his fingers still running over the delicate details on the metal. "It's strange, I feel like I'm starting to understand more about him. About my dad, I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him, but at least I feel ready to move forward." "That's all that matters," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. Paul needed time to understand himself too. Forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once. It's something you build, piece by piece. As the watch marked midnight, Andrew and James stepped outside into the snow-covered garden to gaze at the stars. The sky was clear, and the moon's light illuminated the landscape with a tranquil beauty. Leo dashed happily between them, leaving a trail of paw prints in the fresh snow. "Did you ever think about leaving this house?" James asked suddenly, breaking the peaceful silence. "Many times," Andrew admitted, his eyes fixed on the sky. "After Paul was gone, it felt like this place was swallowing me whole. Every corner was a reminder of things that hurt too much, but now I see it differently. It's not just a place full of memories of what I lost, but also of what I still have." James smiled, understanding the weight of those words. "I think I feel the same. I never thought I'd find a place where I really belonged. But here I feel at home." "That's because this has always been your home, even if you didn't know it," Andrew said, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Family isn't always perfect, James, but it's what gives us roots and wings. I want you to remember that, no matter what." James looked at him, his eyes mirroring the same deep emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "For not giving up on him?" Andrew shook his head, his smile gentle. "Thank you for giving me a second chance. Paul would be proud of you, James. I know that for certain." The next day, the mansion was alive with movement and laughter, as James suggested decorating the Christmas tree with Andrew. It was a small gesture, but for both of them, it carried immense meaning as they hung ornaments and strung lights. Leo bounded around them, barking excitedly, as if he understood the importance of the moment. "Do you think this tree's too small for a house this big?" James joked, as he adjusted a star at the top. "It's not the size that matters, it's what it represents," Andrew replied, his gaze soft as he admired the tree. "And this one represents everything we've built together." When they finished, they sat together in front of the tree, admiring their work. The mansion, once shrouded in shadows and silence, now glowed with a warm, vibrant light. "Merry Christmas, James," Andrew said, raising a glass of wine in a toast. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," James replied, lifting his own glass with a genuine smile. The toast marked not just the end of a difficult year, but the beginning of something new. A family, once fractured by time and secrets, had found a way to rebuild itself. The snow continued to fall softly outside, but inside, the warmth of love, forgiveness, and hope had taken root, promising brighter days ahead. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment.